Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It is the one and only V, the Guerrilla Economist. We have with us the man of the hour who needs no introduction whatsoever. It is Harley Schlanger. You can check out his work over at LaRouchePack.com and the SchillerInstitute.org. And with that being said, he is the voice of reason in the geostrategic fog of war that is now bursting at the brim with viruses and oil wars. Harley, where do you want to begin, my friend?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that people shouldn't panic
Yeah,
because thinking is required. And when you're panicked, you can't think.
correct.
And I think panic is what might end up giving Joe Biden the Democratic nomination. So panic is not advisable.
No.
On the other hand, you have to recognize that solutions are going to take some work because the whole drive behind panicking is the fact that we see so much insanity. And
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine how to get out of this situation. You look at the Congress, and one would come away from a serious look at Congress quite hopeless. You look at the strategic situation overall, and even though we see some very significant moves by Putin to try and calm things down in the Middle East, on the whole, there's a lot of craziness. And then you look at the what's happening with the coronavirus, and if all you see is the media, you would think that we're already at the point of millions of people having died. Now, I don't
Yeah.
want to minimize what this might end up being because we until we know for sure what's causing it and how to treat it, it represents something that's an unknown. However, there are things that we know, and one of those is that the crash of the stock market was not caused by a virus. It was caused by 40 to 50 years of stupidity,
Yeah.
of creating a funny money system, a speculative Ponzi scheme, and every Ponzi scheme eventually collapses. And we're seeing now a collapse of the Ponzi scheme. Some people are going to try and blame Putin or the Saudis now. Others are blaming the Chinese for the coronavirus. Maybe we should be looking instead at the viral stupidity of Western elites over the last 40 years, thinking that you can create wealth and prosperity while shutting down a productive economic system
Right.
and turning it into a service sector speculative debt bubble.
Yeah.
So I think, with that said as a kind of a preface, we can get into the solutions, but I don't want to minimize the crisis except to say that the kind of reactions we're seeing from the media. I mean, I saw a Washington Post article yesterday, which was almost gleeful that, but with the prospect that coronavirus might get out of control in the United States, because they were saying this can be turned against Trump. So
People are
when you
sick.
have media that's that cynical and immoral, and people in Washington, D.C. read it and believe it, then you see what the problem is. And that kind of virulent messaging from the media is, I would argue, more dangerous ultimately than the coronavirus will turn out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. hmm After all, as I was saying before we went live, Harley, since Donald Trump is such a Russian agent, and Putin wants to ensure that Trump gets reelected, what better way than to create a financial maelstrom that will probably that will create more pressure on Donald Trump anyway. I mean, that's just genius, right?
Well, we all know that Putin was able to take $100,000 and win an election for
Is that
Donald
incredible?
Trump,
I
whereas
mean,
Michael Bloomberg took $500 million and was
he
able
won
to get,
175 votes on the island of Samoa.
yeah. Well, he has 44 delegates, which means 13.6 million per delegate.
Oh my god!
If you have a bridge to sell in lower Manhattan, give Michael Bloomberg a call.
Oh my god! Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
So
Harley,
the whole
good.
question on the Putin thing is interesting because what we're seeing with the oil situation is not something that just happened again in the last couple of days. You've had efforts made over a period of time to come to certain agreements.
Yeah.
At the same time, the U.S. and in this case, people who are advising Trump are saying the U.S. Oil surplus, energy surplus, ought to be a big seller and make us a lot of money.
Hmm.
And with something like energy, where it's unequally distributed worldwide, the prices many times have very little resemblance to the actual cost of production.
Yeah.
And then you have something like the shale oil, which is supposedly such a great benefit to the United States. But look at the total volumes of debt that are associated with it.
It's a mess.
And you can see that by having the oil price drop, this is going to put extra pressure on American banks, which are already trying to deal with zombie corporations. And I just read a few minutes ago that the Fed is going to up their overnight repo loans
Yeah.
to $150 billion. So this is the helicopter money that Ben Bernanke promised. Is
Hmm.
that going to get into people's pockets? Is that going to end up with people consuming more?
Yeah.
Not with the interest rates on credit cards that exist.
Yep.
So this is a completely phony economic model, or I should say, a failed economic model.
Yeah.
And the idea that you can deal with real crises like disease, like shutdown of industrial production, a shift into a green economy, those are real problems. The idea that you're going to deal with them by creating new speculative bubbles is completely insane.
Right. Absolutely correct. I just got off the phone before I was on the air with you. I just got off the phone with one of my cohorts who's a former Wall Streeter. He worked for Nomura. He worked, lived in Japan for quite a number of years, and he's back on Wall Street and doing some consultancy work. And the rumor is that, yes, you probably heard about this already, that the Fed will cut interest rates by 50 basis points this month and probably look at another 50 basis point cut next month. But the point is, it's like, he made a valid point. Nobody, look, whatever the administration needs to do, he has to save the small business owner, because helping Wall Street is not going to do much, because at the end of the day, the average Joe on the street does not care about what the Fed fund rate is,
Yeah.
and there has to be a real move here in order to save the physical economy. If we keep throwing money on the phantom economy with the phantom growth, it's just gonna my God, we're just throwing fuel on the fire, Harley.
Well, it's the classic case that the bubble isn't a bubble until it pops.
Yeah.
And so they're hoping that they can keep expanding the bubble and
Yep.
use that as a sign to lure people into complacency about the economy. Now,
Yeah.
the problem is this bubble has already taken many millions of Americans as victims because people have lost jobs
Right.
because of the globalization and the cutback of industry and manufacturing. Millions of Americans are working in lower wage jobs than they had 10, 15 years ago. They have more debt today than ever. Consumer debt has grown enormously, but so is corporate debt. And what the Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, I should say, bailout policy, this going from 100 billion overnight lending to 150 billion overnight lending, which is pretty much what Powell is committed to. All that does is provide liquidity for zombie corporations to keep their debt levels moderately liquid for another day. But then after they pay it back, they're right back in the same place, maybe even worse. The idea that borrowing money and having to pay interest on the money that you're borrowing for 24 hours, when you use the money you borrow to balance the books for the moment,
Right.
and then you end up out of balance again when you pay it back plus interest, how the hell does that solve anything? It keeps the zombies alive. It really is a case of the Dracula sucking all the blood out of his patient and then giving him a transfusion before he comes in to suck them again.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we've got going with the Federal Reserve and Wall Street. And it's not going to revive the patient. Now, Helga Zepp LaRouche put out an updated emergency call today, which I would urge your listeners and viewers to go to larouchepack.com and read, because the first point she makes is that we must immediately move for a full bank separation policy
Correct.
based on the Glass-Steagall, the original Glass-Steagall of Franklin Roosevelt in June 33. Because what's necessary, as you just said, you've got to protect the small businessmen. You've got to
Right.
protect the family, the people who have money in checking accounts and savings accounts, those who still have them. Because what is going to happen if you don't have a Glass-Steagall policy, the banks will steal their depositors' money. It's already pledged. The depositor's money is already pledged as part of the basis for the huge leverage that
Yep.
these banks are running. So if the leverage calls or the margin calls come in, it's gone. So unless you have a Glass-Steagall which says we're not going to allow either a bailout or a bail-in by commercial institutions, by our investment banks, by hedge funds, by others, unless you have that, you're setting every single person up who's got a penny left in an account to be robbed. And so that's the first step you have to have. Secondly, Hamiltonian credit policy, and not just for the United States, but for everywhere. Instead of bailout money, the idea that every bank, central bank, is going to produce helicopter money to stimulate the economy. Who are they stimulating? If you look at the average person, if you give them a tax cut, a portion of that money is going to go to pay down their existing debt. It's not going to go into buying new yachts
Right.
and new private jets. The idea that this is a stimulus plan is absurd. And this was the absurdity was what Bush was proposing back in 2008, what Obama did for 8 years, and what the Fed and others are still trying to do. And Trump is up against that. He's stuck in a situation where he's facing a collapse that they'll blame on him. And I think that the reason Mrs. LaRouche issued this new statement is to get the population ahead of Wall Street, ahead of the Fed, so that people know what's coming and can act to preempt it. And that's why we need a Glass-Steagall policy right now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many things that need to be done right now because the financial systems are starting to buckle, and they're buckling bad. Um, my concern, Harley, is the system is far from broken, but it's starting to buckle. The gross incompetence, and we're going to see a lot of gross incompetence in the next few days, in the next few weeks, especially from the large bureaucracies as they step in, Harley, to show how valuable they are. To show how relevant they are. You're going to see a lot of it, and there's going to be a lot of pandering and a lot of fear mongering, which will do nothing more but then already stress out a fragile delivery and economic system, Harley. And I'm concerned about that.
Well, just watch what's going to come out of the idiots in Congress
Yeah.
in their proposals, or watch Joe Biden. Biden, the slow, steady hand, supposedly. I mean, unless
Yeah.
he's talking about masturbation, I haven't seen a slow, steady hand with him. Well, and given his state of mind, that may be what he's talking about.
It's probably what it is, Harley. I mean, he did say that he has
It's,
hairy legs and he likes kids on his lap. I got hairy legs, and every
yeah,
time the kids come in the pool, they pull my legs down, and they watch the hair comes up, and that's when I learned about roaches, and I
yeah.
learned about kids jumping on my lap. I love kids jumping on my lap.
Well, you've got a situation where the Democratic Party is so desperate, they're turning to a guy who virtually every other sentence out of his mouth exhibits a sign of mental instability and or dementia.
Yeah,
And the with all the talk they've done about Trump and how Trump is unpredictable and Trump is misogynistic and this and that, you look at Biden and you realize that Biden will be a placeholder for a team like what Obama brought in with
right.
people like Timothy Geithner
Yep,
and people like John Brennan,
yep.
that we're moving into a period of what some people call a security state, a national security state, where everything is monitored and controlled. This is what the whole topic of the Federal Reserve retreat at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, was this last summer. How do we give the power to the central bankers to take it away from elected officials? That's what
Yeah.
they openly were talking about, V. Mark Carney from the Bank of England basically using the Green Revolution to say banks should not loan anything to any company that has a carbon footprint. Well, what's a carbon footprint? Maybe they produce something. Well, you're not going to allow production.
Right.
You're only going to allow boondoggles like the various forms of solar and wind power that have to be subsidized to be able to make any money. So when you think about this idea of the what's his name, Fink of BlackRock, who came out with a statement saying that we have to have a regime change in finance. And what he said is that it's fiscal policy is too important to leave to the politicians. It has to be in the hands of the bankers and financial
Hmm.
institutions. What do they mean by fiscal policy? They mean government. They mean any form of budget. That this is going to be handed to the private banks that have created the bubbles of the last 20 years.
Right.
I mean, if people knew that this is what they were talking about, there'd be even more people riled up and in the streets. The problem is the media won't cover it. And
No.
so you have these backroom discussions. And look, Jackson Hole was not even a backroom discussion, but they didn't really report what they said. Mark Carney, is completely open about this. He's saying no more lending to anyone that produces anything. That's what Bloomberg's campaign is about. That's what they're trying to impose on the Democrats with the Green New Deal, which most of them support. So we've got to get people to come out openly and express their anger, not just by yelling or throwing rocks or screaming, but by actually learning
Hmm.
why we got to this situation, how we did, who's
Right.
benefiting, who's profiting, what they intend to do. And in the back of it all is radical depopulation policy. That's what they're pushing for. And again, you may have people like Greta Thunberg who doesn't want to have a kid like her, so she's advocating maybe people shouldn't have kids anymore. There's a whole movement in Germany now saying that the real feminism is to not have children.
So
And
stupid.
what happens if that's the case? Well, you
Well,
have
what happens is you're going to have migrants coming in from North Africa and the Middle East that's going to completely displace the entire population of the West. That's exactly what's going to happen.
well, and
People
what
are
will happen
crazy.
is many of them are going to die before they come here because their
Yep.
countries are the food is being devoured by locusts. There'll be spread of disease, and the ones that do come will be bringing diseases. And in the meantime, the diseases will spread here because we're decimating our healthcare system in order to meet the austerity demands of the bankers.
Yeah.
We used to have a standard called the Hill-Burton standard, which advocated, I think it was 4.4 or 4.5 beds per thousand people, hospital beds per thousand people. That was the gold standard for the US through the 50s and 60s. It's now less than half that in
That is
reality because we abandoned the Hill-Burton policy in return for profit healthcare.
correct. Correct.
So, and Hill-Burton was not socialized medicine. It
Yeah.
was communities working together with various kinds of independent hospitals, community hospitals, university teaching hospitals, and it worked, but it didn't create a lot of profit. And so the neoliberals came in and said, why not make money on healthcare? Well, there's a reason for it. There are certain things that when you make money, it ought to be for providing a full service. And to do that, you don't make that much money. But that's okay if you have a stable economy. 3-4% annual rate of profit is great, especially if you have no inflation. But if you get everyone dependent on the risk involved in trying to get 10 or 15% return, you end up taking that money out of what's needed for the physical economy. And
Yeah.
that's what we're suffering through right now.
Right. Right. Exactly right. You know, Harley, what do you think? What's you have Italy right now. Northern Italy is pretty much on lockdown. Um, and this contagion is spreading economically. What are some of the politicians and those that are connected to the politicians in and the leadership in Italy and in Europe in general? What have they been telling you? What have you been hearing?
Well, here's an example of what I was just talking about with neoliberal economics. Italy has lost 72,000 hospital beds in 10 years because of European Union austerity policy.
Right.
When the government said they wanted to put more money into healthcare, the EU said you can't do it. That's unfairly subsidizing a public service at the expense of private operations. So that's the perfect example of neoliberalism. Now they need the hospital beds. There's an Italian epidemiologist who came out yesterday and said that Italy is going to need 10 times the number of hospital beds within a month than they now have.
Yeah.
And said it'll go up to 100 times.
Yep.
He said, even if this isn't the most virulent disease, we're not prepared for it. And he
Correct.
specifically said this is because of EU policy. So the Conti government asked the European Union for the right to come up with 2.3 billion euros to deal with the emergency. And the European Union said, okay, we're not such bad guys. We'll give it to you, but here are the conditions. And the conditions are almost unacceptable. Now, meanwhile, the Chinese just sent several 100,000 masks
Yeah.
to Italy. And the Chinese are also sending doctors. Now, I'm not saying that China has solved the problem,
Right.
but they're seeing this as something they have to address, not just in China, but globally. And I think for people who want to get their panties all up in a bunch over China, take some advice from Donald Trump. Trump continues to praise what the Chinese are doing. And he said, look, if we come up with something that works, we'll share it with China just the way they would with us, because
Yeah.
that's the way we're working together. And he said, we're working with Italy, South Korea, China. And yet you have fools like Marco Rubio and Colonel Blimp, Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who spend most of their day running around attacking China.
Yep.
So, it's as I said earlier, the Washington Post is sort of cheering on a pandemic because they say they can use this against Trump. So this is
It just shows you that the pandemic is not virulent, as not as deadly to the human body as they think it is, but it is damaging to the psyche and this fragile economy, which it is doing.
well, and you think about the Washington Post, which editorializes all the time about how nasty Trump is, and then their so-called objective reporters can't hide their glee at the fact that don't seem to have a handle yet in the United States on the coronavirus.
Mhm.
Well, instead of doing a public service by urging everyone to find out as much as they can about it, they continue to spread half truths and create panic,
Correct.
using it as a political weapon against Donald Trump.
Hmm. Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So that's what we're dealing with. V. We've got a lot of nasty speculators and risk takers who take risks with your money and mine, not with their own,
Yeah.
and they reap the profit when the swindle works. And if it doesn't work, they pass on the loss to us. And
Yep.
that's why, again, for those people who don't know what Glass-Steagall is, one of the things you could do is there's a very good book about the Pecora Committee hearings.
Oh my God, we need a Pecora committee today.
We absolutely do. And the closest we got was Phil Angelides, who it's like putting a Chihuahua in charge of a wolf hunt.
Yeah.
So
Agreed.
we need a real hellhound to go after the banks. The evidence is there. The reports of what TARP was, we're told it was 700 billion and it was all paid back. That's nonsense. It was
Bull.
over 20 trillion, maybe as much as 27 trillion. And
Yep.
it's still going out. And
Yep.
the fact that people say, well, this overnight money, it's not cumulative, it comes back every night. Well, it's not cumulative, but it's growing and growing because the number of zombie corporations are growing, their needs are growing, and all they're doing is covering overnight needs and creating more debt in the process. So instead of playing games with numbers, look at the reality. These are companies that should be cut off. They're companies that should be put through bankruptcy, including a number of hedge funds. And instead, they're being kept alive by promises from the Central Bank of the United States, which is not a government bank, it's not a public institution, it's a front for the private swindlers.
Yeah,
And that's got to stop.
absolutely. Absolutely. Harley, thank you so much for being on and sharing all this information with us. Folks, once again, you can follow him over at larouchepack.com and theschillerinstitute.org. Any last words, Harley?
Just get active, stay calm, maybe instead of a Corona tonight, have a margarita. Take a little bit of time to reflect on where we want to go in the future, because the future is being determined by what you do right now.
Right.
And if you're going to sit there and complain and whine and point fingers, nothing's going to be solved. We need action. And we have an election campaign where people are starting to pay attention to these things. And the more people who are speaking out boldly with policy solutions, look, we saw it in 2016. Donald Trump endorsed Glass-Steagall in the latter phases of the 2016 campaign. And then, unfortunately, you had Gary Cohn and Mnuchin come in who said, well, we can't do it. And Kudlow, we can't do it. Well, maybe these guys should be replaced with people who say, we're going to do it.
Yep.
And so I think that's what people should be demanding.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Very well said, folks. Thank you all for listening in. We'll be back again next week. Enjoy your week, everyone. And Harley, thank you for being with us. Be safe out there, my friend.
See you next week.
Take care.